to the First Gnostic Church of Christ. We continue our read and commentary of the Nag Hammadi Library. We are up to the text titled Plato Republic 588A through 589B. As usual, let's do a bit of a backdrop regarding this specific text, and just as the one prior, there is not a Wikipedia write-up. However, there are a few write-ups on the internet I would like to share so that we have some idea of what we're getting into. First off, understand this particular text is not penned by a Gnostic author. It is in fact an excerpt from Plato's Republic, specifically a dialogue he transcribes Socrates has about justice versus injustice and which of those ways better serves the individual. Let's start with the first write-up, and that is, again, confirming the Nag Hammadi Library contains early Christian Gnostic text, and while Plato's Republic isn't directly part of it, the Gnostic texts found there, particularly those in Codex V, reflect a philosophical and theological influence heavily rooted in Platoism, including the ideas found in Republic 588A and 589B. Recall that all of the writings were found in a jar in a cave in Egypt. Many of those included Christian texts and originally penned Gnostic texts, along with texts that Gnostics resonated with, excerpts and writings from philosophers of the time throughout time. And so that's what we're having here. This, again, is a text written specifically by Plato, recounting a conversation Socrates has in the writing of Republic. So this collection of texts discovered near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt, as I said, includes a variety of early Christian and Gnostic writings, as well as Greek writings. Now, you could consider that Plato's philosophy was Gnostic in nature. But recall, in Gnosticism, we learned that the Bible as well as Gnostic philosophy came about far before Plato came about. So we couldn't necessarily say, even though this is an excerpt from Republic, Plato influenced Gnosticism so much as Gnosticism perhaps influenced Plato and other philosophers along the way. So again, Gnostic influence often draw upon philosophical ideas from the Greek tradition, including Platonism. Gnostic thought is reflected in the Nag Hammadi text, often incorporates Platonic concepts like the idea of transcendent realm. It has it backwards, in my opinion, because again, most of general society either is secular or influenced by the Christian paradigm of the way they understand philosophical or spiritual teachings. Gnosticism came way before Plato was born. Now again, Plato was born somewhere in period of 428 to 423 BC, 400 years before Christ. And of course we know that Gnosticism, some of the texts written in the Nag Hammadi include by Adam, which would be the first Hebrew human. This section of the Republic discussed the concept of justice and its relationship to happiness, arguing that it is better to be just than unjust. And of course, this was the standpoint that Socrates was taking, and others would have a dialectic interchange with other philosophers who posit their support for, if you can get away with it, then perhaps injustice would serve you more. That's the key discussion, dialectic discussion. Always keep in mind these discussions were dialectic in nature, not debate forums. So they were not arguing from an emotional standpoint or an invested standpoint. They were generally interested in getting at the essence of truth about a specific question or topic. And so here it says connection to the Nag Hammadi text. While the Republic itself isn't part of the Nag Hammadi Library, the ideas about justice, the soul, and the nature of reality found in Republic 588A through 589B are echoed in various Gnostic texts, demonstrating the influence of Platonism on Gnostic thought. Now again, I can't not keep emphasizing the opposite is true. Gnosticism likely, in general, influenced many Greek and other philosophers throughout the world. All right, now, with that, they give a couple examples. The Gnostic texts in Codex II often explore themes of the soul's descent into the material world and its eventual return to a higher realm, which aligns with Platonic ideas. Now, it's no hidden secret, Gnostics revere to a great extent Plato and among all the other philosophers, because many of his concepts and ideas line up with Gnostic thought. Among them is just explained the idea of higher realms, the idea of the soul's descent into the material world. However, where we might differ, or we would differ as Gnostics, is that it isn't the soul that is descending into the material world, but it is the spiritual self that is descending into the material world. And then later, a soul is created by Sophia as a kind of mind, as a consort to what was requested by Christ before the mother. And keep in mind, the feminine nature is in fact the mother, Sophia, the one and the same. The feminine nature, or archetype, then presents what's called the mind, another way of saying the soul, or the radar dish that we talk about often on this channel. That's where the soul allows a intermediary between the physical body and the spiritual self. Whereas Plato might argue that the soul he did argue that the soul descended the higher realms to the material world, the spiritual world, and to the material world. All right, now let's go to the next section where I wanted to point out a couple of contributions, influences Gnosticism had on Plato, and that is the theory of forms or ideas. And in this particular case, the theory of forms, a metaphysical concept that suggests there is a idealistic realm and a realistic realm. Idealistic realm is where the true forms reside. And we talk about this often on this channel, where everything in this realm is an artifact or a mock-up that the demiurge copied from the higher realms, the true forms, or rather Plato's teachings are similar to the Gnostic thought in that sense. So the theory suggests that the physical world is not as real or true as the forms, what he calls forms. We call spiritual essence, or we call essences. And that's where later you get the group of Gnostics around the time of Christ known as the Essenes, named after the concept of the essences. According to this theory, forms, conventionally capitalized and also commonly translated as ideas, are the non-physical, timeless, absolute, unchangeable essences of all things. And it does point out here essences, which objects and matter in the physical world merely imitate, resemble, or participate in. And we have a clearer example of that in Genesis chapter 1, where it talks about, in the beginning God created everything, versus in chapter 2, where the Lord God formed or made. He didn't create, but he formed, he made, which is very different. Creating is taking from nothing and bringing about something, whereas forming, making, think about, taking clay and you're forming something or shaping something. So you're taking from something that's already pre-existing, or you're trying to bring about, form something, resembles whatever is the idea in your head. You're going to try to come as close as possible. You'll likely never be able to reach that idea perfectly. So Plato speaks of these entities only through the characters, primarily Socrates, in his dialogues, who sometimes suggest that these forms are the only objects of study that can provide knowledge. Again, in this realm, Plato also would suggest there is a lower realm of forms, or basically mock-ups of the timeless, perfect forms he also uses the term pleroma, but the word pleroma just means fullness. So these are actually Latin terms that are shared among many Mediterranean and other nations of that time. Okay, now with that, let's move on to the next section so we get a little bit more clarity about what are we getting into exactly with this text. It's very short, it's about a page or two long, and it's just excerpts of conversation. There's no real context that's built or story or stage, much in the way of the Book of Thomas. You're just getting sayings by these characters. In this case, Book of Thomas would be Christ speaking. In the Republic, it's Socrates. So Socrates uses the image of the soul to illustrate the nature of justice and injustice, arguing that a just soul with its rational part in control is happier than an unjust soul where the appetitive and spirited parts dominate. Now, here's another difference that Plato and Socrates and the Greeks often had with Gnostics, and that is the way they define the highest form. In this, when we're thinking about highest, we're not thinking about hierarchy, but rather we're thinking about being as close to that perfect form and gnosis or knowledge, that perfect knowledge, than that comparative other. And in this case, they would say soul is the highest form. But in Gnosticism, we would say the spirit is the highest form. Even Greeks would often argue if we allowed our spirits to get the better part of us and dominate us, then they might take us out of control. And this is where we talk about unruly spirits, things of that nature, or dark spirits versus light spirits. This is lingo that's being used from much Greek influence, or any kind of philosophy that was around that time, including Mandean, that came from Asia Minor. So these all, of course, interplayed with each other and influenced one another. And so here there's an argument. Socrates and his interlocutors have been discussing whether injustice is profitable, even if it goes unpunished. And the image of the soul, to make the argument clearer, Socrates proposes using an image of the soul, which he describes as having three parts: the rational, or thinking, the spirited, or courageous, and the appetitive, or desiring. And notice here again, there's a similarity to what Gnostics also posited, and that is there's humans are made up of three parts, and that's the spiritual, the soul-oriented, and the physical or oriented, or material-oriented. And you could argue here, Greeks would say the rational or thinking self is what Gnostics would call the spiritual self, and the spirited or courageous self would what Gnostics would call the soul, or there's the nomadic, and in this case the psychic. And then finally the appetitive or desiring self would be known as the materials or flesh-oriented self per Gnostics. And the just soul, the rational part, which desires wisdom and truth, rules over the other two parts, leading to a harmonious and virtuous life. Conversely, in an unjust soul, the appetitive part, driven by desires and pleasures, takes control, leading to a life of chaos and disharmony. Now, it's interesting how they make a demarcation, a very stark demarcation between a just soul versus an unjust soul, and how they define what we engage in as being definitive in describing what is a just versus unjust soul. In Gnosticism, we would argue there is not such a clear distinction. It's more about moderation and balance and harmonizing of the opposites that is going to bring about the most beneficial form or creation, or what we call a possession in that last book. But essentially, what in Gnosticism we call the accomplishment, or bringing forth the seed. And that comes about best when we're able to harmonize the opposites. And that's where the alchemical potential exists. And in this case, Greeks maybe would not argue so much about that. They would say that that's where we get Stoicism and things of that nature, which Greeks would tend to be a little bit more leaning toward Stoicism than would Gnostics in general. The analogy of the animal. Socrates used the analogy of the soul as a composite animal, with the rational part as the man, the spirited part of the lion, and the appetitive part as the many-headed beast. Now notice how we're using terms when we think about Yaldabaoth. How was he described? He was described as a serpent with a lion's head. The spirited part, again, that part that is out of control, is the lion, or the courageous part. And the many-headed beast, well, that term is used in Revelations from the Bible to suggest that Socrates and Plato influenced Gnostics. I think, that's maybe Gnostics that came after Plato and Socrates, but I would argue, again, it's Gnosticism that seemed to have quite an influence in the Greek culture among philosophers of that time. Now, Socrates argues that a life guided by reason and justice is more fulfilling and profitable than a life dominated by desires and injustice. Now, how we describe injustice, because you can see how this does potentially suggest morality. There's what's called just, and there's what's called unjust. And this is where you get other philosophers later, like Aristotle, that are a lot more conservative. And I think you can see how they then set the tone for the way the early Christians came out of Asia Minor and out of parts of what today would be southeastern Europe, as they spread into Europe, brought with them that context. It was an interplay. And you can also see how this plays out in the first couple centuries after Christ's walk here on earth, which is how that philosophy was then demarcated between Gnostics and the early church fathers, the Orthodox understanding, which now dominates and has dominated for over 2,000 years. So the section also explores the fall into ethical chaos, and this does sound very similar to the concept of the fall in the Bible in Genesis chapter 1, being ousted from the Garden of Eden. But in Gnosticism, we don't have that kind of fall. We have merely a set of events where we're being forced out that Garden of Eden. And remember, in Gnosticism, we have two kinds of Gardens of Eden, the Garden of Gone and the Garden of Eden. Humankind is essentially kicked out of that garden and represented by many-headed mythological beasts such as the Chimera and the Cerberus. And these are animals that, obviously are multi-headed dog and animals that have concoction of many different beasts. The idea here is humans really are a concoction. They're made up of three parts. And this is the whole idea. Again, you can see where Plato's taking from the tripartite human, from the Gnostic understanding. All right, with all of that, I think then this text will be quite straightforward for us, is it's already pretty much laid out what is its purpose. But at the end of that, I'll just make a comment to bring it into the Gnostic philosophy. And so let's begin the reading commentary. It is written here, and again, they're all in quotes because it's just taking excerpts of dialogue. Since we have come to this point in a discussion, this is Socrates, let us again take up the first things that we were said to us. And we will find that he says, good is he who has been done unjust completely. He is glorified justly. Is not this how he was reproached? So in other words, we gain some kind of knowledge. We're getting something from being on the receiving end of injustice. So here already Socrates is setting up the idea, he's trying to collect points of why it's better to be just versus unjust. So already he's saying, I've got one up on being unjust, because being just despite people being unjust to you, you gain something from it. And that is, you gain knowledge. This is certainly the fitting way, he suggests. And I said, now then, we have spoken because he said that he who does injustice and he who does justice, each has a force. So they have a point of view, they have reasoning why to do one versus the other is better. How then? So how? Well, tell us. He said, an image that has no likeness is the rationality of soul, so that he who said these things will understand. So in other words, the body, the flesh is what is keeping us from being rational. And it's better you don't have a body, because those inclinations, those desires are going to blind you or intoxicate you. So it's better you didn't have. But he's comparing the idea that to be just is coming from the soul. It's not coming from the body. And we know that the body is wild. And so therefore, don't we already, as Greeks, all ascertain ascendancy toward the higher forms? So he's already contextualizing. Isn't that the way we understand things already? But all, ... who told them, ... ruler, these now have become natural creatures, even Chimera and Cerberus, and all the rest that were mentioned. They all came down, and they cast off forms and images, and they all became a single image. And so how they basically became a hybrid. It was said, work now. So now you got to work. You got to toil, because this is going to be a burden for you. And here you can see, again, the similarity of how God says, cast them out of the garden, and now you're going to have to toil. You can see the similarities, right? You wouldn't argue Genesis is influenced by Plato or Socrates, would you? So therefore, why would you argue that about the Gnostic text? Certainly, it is a single image that became the image of a complex beast with many heads. Some days, indeed, it is like the image of a wild beast. So in other words, this is sort of the human nature. It just is all over the place. One thing is it wants this, next day it wants that. One day it believes this is the truth, the next day it believes something else is the truth. It's all over the place. Then it is able to cast off the first image. And all these hard and difficult forms emanate from it with effort, since these are formed now with arrogance. And this is suggesting that humans really are hubristic if they think they know everything anyway in the first place. And they take great pains and efforts to think they know the forms, and how to create things perfectly and understand and know things perfectly. And also all the rest that are like them are formed now through the Word. And notice here, again, it's interesting how there's so much similarity between Plato and Socrates and the Greeks in the Republic, in the Bible and Gnostic text, using that concept called the Word. Things are formed through the Word. For now, it is a single image. For the image of the lion is the one thing, and the image of the man is another. ... Single ... is the ... of the ... join. And it's talking about how there was the perfect logos at the beginning, the Word. It was perfect. Everything was godly. It was full knowledge and understanding of our origins and the way we live. We emanated. And then we were put into the physical body. The soul was, in their case. But in our case, the spiritual self. And this brought about the joining and the confusion and how they compare it to chimera and all these other hybrids, right? And this ... much more complex than the first. And the second is small. So it means now things are much more complex than it was before, and now we're diminished as a result. The first was much more clear and large, and now the second is more complex and significantly smaller than what was before. And when we think about small, we're thinking about actual dimensions. We're thinking about metaphorically small in knowledge. In this case, he would argue justice. This is the point he's trying to make. It has been formed. And so it's done. So you can't, therefore, he's arguing, therefore, if the so is what is just, you cannot in any way argue, therefore, that injustice is the higher form. Now then, join them to each other and make them a single one, for they are three, so that they go together. And all are in a single image outside of the image of the man, just like him who is unable to see the things inside him. But what is outside only is what he sees, and it is apparent what a creature his image is in, and that he was formed in a human image. So he's just arguing again, you can see how man is jumping all over the place, so he has to have some kind of hybridization with the lower base animals. And I spoke to him who said that there is a profit in the doing of injustice for the man. Now, so he's going to now get the other person's point of view. Tell me then, I want to know your point of view about why you think it's more profitable to be unjust if you can get away with it than it is to be just, even though you can get away with being just. So if nobody knows, it's like a tree falling in a forest. Is it better to be unjust or is it better to be just? In other words, to be moral. But of course, Gnostics don't really believe in this way. But when we think about justice, we might think about the logos of this realm and how we might think of the word karma instead of justice, or reaping what you sow, as Christ would aptly call it. And this would be about as close as we'd come to this understanding. He who does injustice truly does not profit, nor does he benefit. But what is profitable for him is this, that he cast down every image of the evil beast and trample them along with the images of the lion. But the man is in weakness in this regard, and all the things he does are weak. As a result, he is drawn to the place where he spends time with them. ... and he ... to him and ... but he brings about ... enmity ... and with strife they devour each other among themselves. Just all these things he said to everyone who praises the doing of injustice. Now, it's very difficult to decipher what's being said here, so we can't make a strong argument from reading this paragraph for the interlocutor supporting the idea that if nobody knows the difference, it's better to be unjust than to be just. However, the best I can take out of this is he's suggesting that sometimes people will have enmity against you. That can overcome you. And humans are weak. And so sometimes it's going to be in your best interest to maybe do something not so good. This is what I'm getting from this section. All right, moving on. Then is it not profitable for him who speaks justly? And so now Socrates is coming back. Well, then, if that's true, is there no benefit to being just if nobody knows the difference? And if he does these things and speaks in them, within the man, they take hold firmly. Therefore, especially, he strives to take care of them, and he nourishes them just like the farmer nourishes his produce daily, and the wild beasts keep it from growing. This is interesting. This is very similar to the way Gnostics would understand why it's not necessary to have morals. Because everything that we do, or we don't do, is making us who we are. And that's just the way it is. And so if you're going to participate in injustice, then you're basically making your own bed in some way. It's basically creating your character. And that will then determine your next incarnation, or whether you leave this Konoma or you move on to the higher realms. Because the higher realms are not going to want to take you in. If you're just constantly, participating in things that are destructive or dividing people up and things of that nature. So you have a lot of learning to do, in other words. So this is basically what's being said here, is saying that, yes, there is, and that is that, if a farmer doesn't tend to his own fruit and some of it goes bad, then he's going to lose for it. He's got less crop to share. Or if he doesn't tend to it, the wild beasts will come and eat it. So that's a wonderful, wonderful paragraph there. I mean, I'm definitely going to be using that myself. So that is a very powerful argument for the case for justice. In Gnosticism, we just call it bringing forth the accomplishment or tending to your own. That's it. That's the end of it. That's the whole text. But in that, I think we've gotten a very powerful way in which we can express our Gnostic understanding about what is going to help humans best appreciate doing things that are creative and helpful and healthy and supportive, rather than destructive, dividing, what we call evil, or evening up things. That process against one another doesn't serve a purpose. In fact, it is going to create a kind of rot that, if not tended to and addressed at some point, will undermine self. And that in and of itself is more than enough reason why each of us should strive to do things, grow love, and not judge, and all the things that Christ talked about, and working on self and not being distracted by fear and those things and laws and all of the things on the outside, and trying to blame it and try to either avoid or go into anxiety or panic. So this is quite though short, I think it has some potency here. So very enjoyable to read and go through this process. So that completes that text. So we'll move on to the next text in the next video. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, have a blessed day.